Welcome back to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Bogotá, Colombia. I'm Fanula Sweeney. Today we join Atlantic Fellows on the first day of the convening and a visit to Bogotá's botanical gardens. Over to Halil Goga, Associate Executive Director for Community Engagement, Programming and Impact at the Atlantic Institute, who will brief us on the program for the day.
Today is Monday, the 14th of October. It's the first day of our convening Atlantic Fellows Act on Climate. We are set to meet in about an hour for a short briefing note with our participants, just people getting to meet each other. We're then going to go to Bogotá's botanical gardens to see and experience one of the most well-preserved reserves in Bogotá, to be one with nature. This is what we're working towards, a safer, cleaner, healthier planet. After that, we will move to DEJUSTICIA, our partners in this week's convening, where we will be partners on an event which will include a VR exhibition of Gawi, followed by a panel discussion. Gawi is a film by Miriam Hernandez, which centers the approaches taken by indigenous communities, the Ramuri people in northern Mexico, in defending their land and drawing on their traditional knowledge, which focuses a lot on dreaming and thinking about how they protect the land and be one with nature. We're really excited about the week ahead as well as today. A little bit of nerves, but we've worked hard over the last couple of months to co-create with our fellows, to think about what they want to try and achieve, both individually and collectively. So we are excited, slightly nervous, but ready.
My name's Johnny Miller, and I'm an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics. I was the first cohort in 2017. I have a photo project called Unequal Scenes that focuses on inequality in big cities around the world. I use aerial photography to find the dividing lines in cities between, generally speaking, the poorer areas and the richer areas. Not too far from where we are, there's a less formal neighborhood right next to these gleaming golden buildings from this neighborhood called Chapinero, and a university called the Javeriana University, a very popular, rich private university. So I'm looking at architecture and how wealth inequality presents in the architecture and urban planning and urban design of the city. I think it represents an intentionality and the systematic nature of how we create our cities in these unequal ways. Aerial photography really shows that clearly, I think. Bogotá has an incredible public transportation network that seeks to address inequality and promote the movement of people and environmental factors within the network. So very early on in the 1970s, Bogotá was the first city in Latin America and one of the first in the world to introduce the ciclovia, which means every Sunday they close down a huge part of the road network in Bogotá and make it open only for cyclists. Bogotá is really famous for its bus rapid transit system, the BRT system. And that was started only in the late 90s because Bogotá's public transportation network, in terms of the buses, were heavy polluters. They were quite crowded, and it was actually quite a slow network up until about 1998, 1999, when a really forward-thinking mayor came in, Peñalosa was his name, who decided, you know what, we're going to create an entire new rapid transit system. We're going to use buses. We're not going to get sidetracked with building expensive rail lines and metros and stuff like that. Bogotá now does have a metro, but back then they didn't. So for about 1/10 the cost of a heavy rail network, they decided to build this bus rapid transit network, which is now one of the largest in the entire world. And it's got the second biggest electric bus fleet outside of China, which is pretty incredible because Bogotá is not the most wealthy city that uses BRT systems. COVID also really accelerated the cycle network and the BRT system because they poured a lot of money into the public transport network here as a way to promote equity and to promote transportation in a time of crisis. So for a lot of reasons, I think you can look to Colombia as being at the forefront of equity issues and using infrastructure and transportation networks as the driving force to address inequity issues that I find really inspiring.
Si quieres sigue tú con ellas y adentro les van a esperar. Que hay que abrir las maletas.
Okay, everybody, you're gonna have to just open up your purses or backpacks, whatever, so that they can see inside as you go in. So maybe pass that message along so people know.
My name is Sergio Chaparro, an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity and International Coordinator at DEJUSTICIA, the host organization here in Colombia. We just came out of the tropical areas in Colombia, recreated here in Bogotá, in the Tropicario, at the Botanical Garden. And now we are heading to a sacred place used by indigenous peoples for their deliberations that is called Maloca, where words and the spoken word is the most important vehicle for deliberation and for providing solution to their own issues. We are going to be welcomed there by an indigenous leader from the Huitoto community. This is a community located in the south of the country in the Amazon ecosystem. So the Mayor Fidencio Valencia is going to welcome us to guide us through a journey of how indigenous knowledge must be used also for dealing with climate and environmental problems. Por recibirnos en este lugar, que todo, por reconectarnos con las raíces de estos territorios, de lo que es Colombia, con su riqueza.
My name is Miriam Hernandez. I am an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity from Mexico, and I work in storytelling and virtual reality for change. The project that I am very excited to share with the other fellows and also the activists and journalists here in Colombia, thanks to DEJUSTICIA's hosting us, is Gawi. Gawi is a virtual reality film co-created with Raramuri communities from northern Mexico. This is a special project that I created thanks to my fellowship and the support of Atlantic Institute and the XR Lab. This has been a project about bringing the technology, the immersive technology, close to the communities and see how it can be a tool for them to serve their advocacy, their raising awareness efforts, making it a tool that can serve communities and the people working with communities like myself to bring about transformational change. Gawi means Mother Earth in the Raramuri language. So it's a story about the territory and the indigenous ecological wisdom about how Raramuri communities are every day taking care of this territory and their very important work in preserving the world's biodiversity. 80% of the world's biodiversity is concentrated in territories that are occupied or owned by indigenous communities, yet they represent only 6% of the world's population. So my intention, as well as their motivation to collaborate in the co-creation of this film, is to make the indigenous efforts visible and to gain epistemic justice in terms of who are on the front lines of taking care of and preserving the delicate balance sustaining Earth. My whole approach from the beginning was to address power imbalances, ethics, finding if there is any possibility for really creating genuine collaborations with traditional storytellers. Starting the conversation with them, I learned about their whole trajectory, defending their territory. They shared how they have really tried all the channels. They've done strategic litigation, they've tried through institutional channels, through advocacy, through rituals, through dancing, and they're still facing this land dispossession and this lack of recognition of their ancestral role for defending their territory. So I found that they were partners that were ready and eager to tell their story, and they had organized already around it. So for me, that was a good reason to see where this project could have more impact. We are sharing Gawi at the COP16 in Cali. This is very important in terms of how the VR format can open up spaces for more indigenous voices to be heard, to be acknowledged. Every time that we show Gawi, it always finds a space that resonates with people from New Zealand, Trinidad and Tobago, England, Bolivia. There's always some part of it that reminds us that we're all part of Mother Earth and that we share more than we think.
I'm Busi Dlamini, based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we are currently in Bogotá in an office building that has an upstairs terrace with lush colors, and it's green and beautiful. I'm part of the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity, part of the 2019 cohort. So even though that does feel like a lifetime ago, there is a part of it that feels like the threads of what started in that journey are still so present in my involvement with the Atlantic Institute. And I think part of my own interest in remaining connected is how do we amplify that in other ways. So understanding if we are wanting to effect change, it requires strong relationships that are resilient in times of hardship. And I think in a world that's gone through quite major changes, these relationships are what's going to sustain us as individuals in order to be able to effect the change we want to see. I have a background in systems thinking and scenario planning, and if a huge part of systems thinking is trying to leverage some of the existing power nodes, it can sometimes be unintentionally reproducing the same power nodes. So if you're saying you are designing a process that wants to involve the main players in any system, a food system, the health system, the existing players at the moment are still based on the inequities of the past in terms of South Africa. Often I'd find myself in rooms where it would still be predominantly white, senior people that are incredibly experienced, but not always aware how the majority of society in a South African context might be excluded from some of those conversations or making those decisions. To effect change, as much as people in South Africa, for instance, will say, it's been 30 years since democracy, how are we still here? And there's a part of me that completely agrees with the frustration of how slow things have been. But when I'm also on the other side of trying to effect change in institutions, in society, I also know how challenging it can be for various reasons. But when there are examples of things changing, I do think it requires the kind of servant leadership that I don't think always exists in organizations. I think the thing to understand about climate is we might all be experiencing the climate crisis throughout the world. But how it's impacting us might be different because of where we're located. So both in terms of the present, but also if you understand the historical inequities. And by that I'll mean, am I living in a country that already has the kind of infrastructure, the emergency responses that support me being able to be taken care of when there is a crisis? Versus I am in a region that already was disadvantaged economically, so that would then have a knock-on effect in terms of what does that mean in terms of infrastructure. And then there might be other things in terms of if you think of those inequities not playing just geographically, but also who's impacted, women being more impacted, someone with a disability, how are they impacted? Those are some of the things that we're wanting to consider. So in a community like this, where the Atlantic Fellows come literally from all around the world, we all bring a different piece to the puzzle. And through trying to stitch those together, hopefully in our responses, are those responses trying to create more equity. So the opportunity actually with climate is starting to show us that the spaces that we had always thought either disadvantaged or are needing to be fixed are where the solution's going to come from. So the example I'd like to share is of a community in Colombian in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. A community that has waged a just Herculean resistance in terms of issues of climate. both in terms of drawing from indigenous knowledge, in terms of understanding, in this case, the work that they're doing is preservation of the environment that's also linked to the ocean. So drawing from indigenous knowledge around what this means for them. They've been able to bring in other people or lean into expertise of lawyers in order to be able to advocate for both their own rights, but setting a precedence in terms of some of the court cases that they've been able to wage. Actually, some of that has been of benefit not just to their own community. That's having a ripple effect throughout the country, on the rest of the continent, and sometimes in international gatherings. So there's something about climate that really is calling us to say whose voices were often marginalized. What do those people have to say that might offer the solution that's needed? That's been a powerful experience, and that might be the shift that's required.
My name is Brian Kamanzi. I was in the first group of the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity. I work for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is based at the City University of New York in the United States. I'm from South Africa and have been working with trade unions for a long time, supporting their negotiations around the energy transition. I've got a background in electrical engineering, and I'm just very excited to be here in Bogotá in Colombia to meet and discuss with other fellows who've been interested in working on climate, how they see things, where we are at this conjuncture, and also learn a bit about Colombia specifically, how they think about the relation between humanity and nature, and how that shapes how they think about the future. We've been hosted by a non-for-profit and a social movement, DEJUSTICIA, who have quite a progressive outlook on both the climate and also human rights, indigenous rights. The presence, I think, of indigenous knowledge systems and the issues that have been raised directly by indigenous people in Colombia is definitely very interesting, and how central it is to climate work. That's mirrored in a lot of places in the world. It's often indigenous communities, First Nation communities who've been stewards of the earth forever and are still leading the frontier on defending it. It's really inspiring to hear how people are not talking about indigenous communities as people who need to be saved, but as the agents of change and one of the vanguards of an approach about how to think about things. I want to hear more about how we think about indigenous knowledge systems as not only something for the past, but as something that moves and changes and adapts and also speaks to the modern things that people want, like energy, like housing, like water.
My name is Jonathan Confino. I am a medical doctor from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work on public health. I am the Undersecretary of Health of the province of Buenos Aires. That is the biggest province in Argentina that has about half of the population. And I also try to save some time to do teaching, to work on capacity building and human resources in health. I'm a professor in public health at the University of Buenos Aires and at Universidad Nacional Arturo Jauretche. From my work in public health, we try to work harder, invest more time and invest more resources in the people that need more from us. So from a health equity perspective, from a social justice perspective, we try to identify the vulnerable population as the first target of our policies. In my daily work, I usually face the consequences of climate change. Many times we have to aid the people that have gone through different problems because of rains, for example. Because of the rivers get out of their course, go inside of the houses. With that go many diseases. So I have to assist them. And when we analyze who are the ones that are facing the worst part of the climate change, it's the poorest. So for me, it's a very big injustice that I face every day, because the ones that are less responsible for the climate change crisis are the ones that are suffering more. And on the other hand, the ones that are more responsible, sometimes we talk about global north generally, but of course there are many responsible for this inside each of our countries that take advantage of the planet warming, at least in the short time. So I feel that we that are working in public health, we have to push the agenda of planetary health, a just transition, and climate change. There's a lot of things to do. For example, decarbonizing the health system, working in education with the healthcare workers, engaging with the community that this is something that has to do with them. Sometimes we see climate change as something that is very far. We have that image of the bears in the Arctic, their shelters that are melting. But it's something that has to do with everyday life of each of us, and more than others, the ones that are in the global south or in the poorest places. So we, as leaders, have to be committed. I really celebrate the leadership of the Atlantic Institute taking climate change as a priority. And I'm really happy to be here with leaders in climate change and climate justice, not only to learn, but also to share my experiences. And also after this convening, to identify the possible connections and networking with this lifelong community that I'm sure are going to be an important actor in the discussions that are happening now and will happen in the future.
So I think starting off with the botanical gardens was important for us. The way in which the gardens is set up is to create simulations of microenvironments in Colombia. So you see the differences from jungle terrain to mountain terrain. We don't realize what is at stake. Bogotá is currently going through a water crisis, and every 9 days they get a significant water cut because the rains have not been good. So when we start thinking about climate change and the impact of climate change in urban areas, these are things that we need to consider. How do we build up resilience in our cities as well as our rural areas? The panel discussion at DEJUSTICIA was opened by the DEJUSTICIA director, Diana Esther Guzman Rodriguez, and she was in discussion with the Vice Minister of Environment, Tatiana Avendao. The minister reflected on her role and the relationship with global north countries in trying to bring in equitable change, as well as with petroleum companies, looking at the political dynamics in the region. So putting it in context, understanding the importance of the COP and why Colombia is hosting this COP Biodiversity Conference. What was interesting during the panel discussion was talking about different sorts of dynamics, the difficulties we may encounter, and then the different framings. The relationship that people have with the earth, for example. Ari Goring, who is an indigenous land activist, was talking about indigenous approaches. Ari's input was interesting because she had spent 2 decades at a community level, working primarily with indigenous folks in Australia. The ways in which they see land, the way they see ownership is very different to how we conceptualize private property and owning the land. For them, it's more a relationship with land. Some really interesting points also came up from the floor. For example, Brian Kamanzi, one of our fellows, he focused on Africa, African electrification. He was saying that 2 out of 3 people without electricity are located on the African continent, and the numbers and the ways in which some of the analysis is done is open to interpretation. It could be considered incorrect. So, for example, people would say that they've electrified someone's house when all they've done is installed a solar bulb. But is that electricity? Are you being provided with electricity? That's very different to the electricity that you and I are used to, which is pretty constant and you can run a household. So if we're thinking about just transitions, if we're thinking about emissions, we also have to make sure that Africa and parts of Latin America and Asia are fully electrified. And how do we do that sustainably? There's no perfect way out of this because there will be trade-offs, and we have to make sure that those trade-offs are the right ones.
That brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you for listening. Next time, we join Atlantic Fellows on the second day of the convening. I'm Fionnuala Sweeney, and you've been listening to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Colombia. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on and subscribe to the series wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Atlantic Fellows and their work for equity, please go to our website at www.atlanticfellows.org.